15-year-old Maria held her fevered brother tight. As the sheriff announced she'd be sold for stealing water, the baby sent to an orphanage she'd never see again. Then an Apache warrior stepped from the darkness and offered his family's treasures for the freedom of two strangers he had no reason to save. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Socorro, New Mexico, turning the adobe walls into ovens and the packed earth into a surface too hot to touch with bare feet. It was the summer of 1874, and the drought had stretched into its third relentless month. The Rio Grande ran shallow and brown, barely a trickle of its former self, and every drop of water had become more precious than gold. Maria Castellano pressed her back against the shadowed wall of the general store, her arms aching from the weight of her infant brother Thomas. At 15 years old, her frame was too thin, her face gaunt from months of hunger and worry. The threadbare cotton dress she wore, once her mother's, hung loosely on her narrow shoulders, patched so many times that the original fabric was barely visible. Her dark hair, which had once shone with health, now fell in brittle tangles down her back, tied with a strip of faded cloth. Thomas whimpered against her chest, his small fists clenching and unclenching as fever flushed his cheeks red. He was only 6 months old, and in the 6 months since their parents had died from the fever that swept through the Mexican quarter of town, Maria had fought every single day to keep him alive. Some days, she won that battle. Other days, like today, she felt herself losing. "Shh, pequeño," she whispered, rocking him gently despite her exhaustion. "Shh, I know you're thirsty." "I know." But knowing did nothing to solve the problem. The town well stood in the center of the plaza, its wooden bucket dangling on a rope like a cruel promise just out of reach. Sheriff Morrison had declared 3 weeks ago that only families who paid their water tax could draw from the community well. Those who couldn't pay, the poor, the Mexican families, the drifters, would have to find water elsewhere or buy it at inflated prices from Mr. Henderson's store. Maria had no money. She'd sold everything of value months ago: her mother's silver cross, her father's leather belt, even the clay pots that had been in their family for generations. She'd worked when she could find it, cleaning floors at the saloon, mending clothes for the preacher's wife. But no one wanted to hire a girl with a baby constantly at her hip. The few coins she managed to earn went to milk when she could find it, to cornmeal when she couldn't. She'd tried begging. She'd tried explaining to Sheriff Morrison that Thomas was sick, that he needed water to survive. The sheriff had looked at her with eyes as cold as winter stone and said, "Rules are rules, girl. You want charity? Go to the church." But the church had turned her away too. Father Benedict had taken one look at her brown skin, at the way she spoke English with her mother's Spanish accent, and told her that God helped those who helped themselves. When she'd asked what she was supposed to do, he'd suggested the orphanage in Santa Fe, 2 days' journey north. "They'll take the baby," he'd said. "Give him a proper Christian home." Maria would die before she let anyone take Thomas from her arms. The sun climbed higher, and Thomas's cries grew weaker, more desperate. His tiny mouth opened and closed like a baby bird seeking food, seeking water, seeking relief from the terrible heat that turned his cradle into a furnace. Maria's own throat was parched, her lips cracked and bleeding, but she'd given Thomas the last drops from her canteen that morning. Around her, the town moved with its usual rhythm. Wagons creaked past, raising clouds of dust. Women in bonnets hurried along the wooden sidewalks, parasols raised against the brutal sun. Men congregated outside the saloon, their loud voices carrying on the still air. Children played in the shade of the buildings, their laughter a sharp contrast to Thomas's suffering. No one looked at Maria. No one stopped to ask if she needed help. She'd become invisible, just another piece of the scenery, another unfortunate soul who'd fallen through the cracks of a society that had no room for the weak or the poor. As the church bell tolled noon, Maria made a decision. Tonight, after the town fell asleep, she would take what she needed. She would steal water from the well. She would break the law to save her brother's life. And she would pray that God, if he was listening at all, would understand. Midnight arrived with a silence so complete, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Maria waited in the narrow alley behind the boarding house where she'd been squatting for the past 2 weeks, her body pressed against the rough adobe wall. Thomas wrapped tightly against her chest in a makeshift sling fashioned from her shawl. The baby had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, his breathing shallow and rapid, his small body radiating heat that had nothing to do with the lingering warmth of the desert night. The moon hung low and full, casting silver light across the empty plaza. Maria watched from the shadows as the last lamp in the saloon was extinguished, as the final drunken patron stumbled home, as even the dogs that usually prowled the streets settled into their corners to sleep. She counted to 100, then 200, her heart hammering so hard she was certain someone would hear it. When she could wait no longer, when Thomas stirred with a whimper that threatened to become a cry, she stepped from the shadows. Her bare feet made no sound on the packed earth as she crossed the plaza. The well stood like a sentinel in the center of the square, its wooden frame weathered gray by years of sun and wind. The rope was coarse beneath her fingers as she grasped it, the bucket heavy as she began to lower it into the darkness below. Every creak of the pulley sounded like thunder in her ears. Every breath she took felt like a shout into the silence. The bucket hit water with a soft splash that seemed impossibly loud. Maria froze, her entire body tensing, waiting for doors to fly open, for voices to cry out in alarm. But nothing stirred. The town slept on, oblivious to her crime. She pulled the rope hand over hand, her muscles straining with the effort. The bucket emerged from the well's depths, heavy and sloshing with the precious liquid that meant the difference between her brother's life and death. Water spilled over the sides, darkening the dry earth, and Maria felt tears spring to her eyes at the waste of even those few drops. She had just set the bucket on the stone rim of the well, had just reached for the tin cup that hung on a nail nearby, when the voice cut through the night like a blade. "Well, well, well, what do we have here?" Maria's blood turned to ice. She spun around, clutching Thomas so tightly that he woke with a startled cry. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the shadows beside the general store, his bulk silhouetted against the moonlight, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. Behind him, his deputy, a cruel-faced man named Wade, stepped into view, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows across the plaza. "I had a feeling you might try something like this," Morrison said, his voice carrying that lazy drawl that some men used when they held all the power and knew it. "Been watching you these past few days, girl. Saw that look in your eyes. Desperation. Makes people do stupid things." Maria's throat constricted. She couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stand there with Thomas wailing in her arms and the stolen water gleaming in the bucket beside her like evidence of her guilt. "Please," she finally managed, her voice cracking. "Please! He's sick. He needs water. I wasn't going to take much, just enough for him to drink, just enough to break the law," Morrison interrupted, stepping closer. In the lantern light, his face was hard, the face of a man who'd seen too much hardship to have room for mercy. "You know the rules, Maria. No pay, no water. And theft? That's a serious crime in this territory." Wade moved to her other side, effectively boxing her in. His smile revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "What should we do with her, Sheriff? Lock her up?" "Can't lock her up," Morrison said, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "Who'd take care of the baby? And we can't have an infant in the jail cell. Not fitting." Maria's legs trembled beneath her. Thomas screamed, his face purple with rage and thirst and fever. She clutched him tighter, her mind racing through impossible options, finding no escape. "There is another way," Morrison said slowly, as if the idea was just occurring to him, though Maria suspected he'd planned this all along. "Way to pay back what you've stolen and what you owe to this town." "I'll work," Maria said desperately. "I'll clean, I'll cook, I'll do anything, just please." "Oh, you'll work all right," the sheriff said, "but not for me. There's a family needs a servant girl. The Hendersons, they'll take you on, work off your debt. 7 years should do it." 7 years. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. 7 years of servitude, of belonging to someone else, of having no freedom, no choices, no life of her own. And Thomas, what would become of Thomas? "And the baby," she whispered, though she already knew the answer would break her heart. "The baby goes to the orphanage in Santa Fe," Morrison said flatly. "You can't serve properly with an infant hanging on you. This way he'll be fed, cared for, given to a proper family eventually." "No!" The word tore from Maria's throat. "No, you can't take him. Please, I'll do anything, but don't take my brother." But Morrison had already nodded to Wade, who stepped forward with his arms outstretched. Maria stumbled backward, clutching Thomas with a fierce protectiveness that came from somewhere primal, somewhere beyond thought. "Don't touch him!" she screamed, her voice echoing across the empty plaza. "Don't you dare touch my brother!" Wade lunged forward, his thick fingers reaching for the baby. Maria twisted away, but her exhausted body betrayed her. Her foot caught on the uneven ground, and she fell hard, scraping her knees on the packed earth. She curled around Thomas, shielding him with her body, even as Wade's shadow fell over them both. "Make this easy on yourself, girl," Wade growled, bending down. "The baby's going either way." "Over my dead body," Maria hissed through her tears. "That can be arranged," Wade muttered, his hands closing on her shoulders. It was then that the voice cut through the night, a voice that spoke with an accent Maria didn't recognize, words shaped by a tongue that had learned English as a second language, but spoke it with quiet authority. "Stop." The single word carried such weight that even Wade froze. Morrison's hand went to his gun as 3 figures emerged from the darkness at the far edge of the plaza. They moved like shadows given form, their footsteps silent despite the gravel beneath their feet. The man in front was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders and skin the color of burnished copper. He wore buckskin pants and a vest decorated with intricate beadwork, and around his neck hung several strands of turquoise and silver. But it was his eyes that held Maria transfixed. Dark as midnight, they blazed with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Behind him stood 2 others, older men, with faces weathered by sun and wind, their expressions unreadable in the moonlight. They carried no visible weapons, but something in their bearing suggested they needed none. "Apache?" Morrison said, his voice hardening with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. "What business do you have in town? Thought I made it clear your kind aren't welcome here after sunset." The young man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the slur, but his voice remained calm. "I come in peace, Sheriff. I heard the girl's cry. What crime has she committed that you would tear a child from her arms?" "That's none of your concern," Morrison snapped. "This is white man's law, and it doesn't apply to you. Best you move along before I find a reason to lock you up too." "She stole water," Wade added with a sneer, still gripping Maria's shoulder. "And in case you savages don't understand, that's a crime around here." Maria saw the muscles in the young Apache's jaw flex, saw his companions tense behind him. For a moment, she thought violence would erupt right there in the plaza, but instead, the young man took a slow breath and stepped forward, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Water," he said softly, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. You risked this for water, for your brother? Maria nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Thomas had gone quiet against her chest, his small face turned toward this stranger, as if sensing something in him that Maria herself felt, a recognition, a kinship born of shared suffering. The Apache man looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes, Maria saw a pain that mirrored her own. It was the look of someone who had lost everything, who understood exactly what she stood to lose. He turned back to Morrison, and when he spoke again, his voice was stronger. How much does she owe? Morrison laughed, a harsh sound in the still night. More than you could pay, Indian. 7 years of labor, that's her sentence. Unless you got 7 years to give me, I suggest I have something better. The young man interrupted. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a pottery vessel, its surface decorated with geometric patterns in black and red. Even in the dim lantern light, Maria could see it was beautiful, clearly ancient, worth more than anything she'd ever owned. He set it carefully on the ground, then removed the turquoise pendant from around his neck and placed it beside the pot. The silver caught the moonlight, gleaming like captured starlight. This pottery is from my grandmother's grandmother, he said quietly. It has been in my family for more generations than I can count. The turquoise was mined by my people in the sacred mountains. Together, they are worth far more than 7 years of any person's labor. Morrison stared at the offerings, and Maria saw the greed flicker across his face. She saw him calculating, weighing the value of her servitude against the immediate gain of such treasures. The silence stretched taut as a rope about to snap. Wade shifted beside Maria, his grip on her shoulder loosening as he too stared at the treasures gleaming on the ground. In the distance, a coyote howled, its lonely cry echoing across the desert hills. Sheriff Morrison picked up the pottery vessel, turning it slowly in his hands. His fingers traced the ancient patterns, and Maria could see him calculating its worth. The turquoise pendant caught the moonlight, throwing blue-green shadows across the packed earth. This doesn't change what she did, Morrison said finally, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Law's the law. And gold is gold, the Apache replied evenly. That pottery alone could buy 3 horses. The turquoise would feed a family for a year. You know this, Sheriff. The question is whether you value these more than you value punishing a hungry girl. Morrison's jaw worked as he ground his teeth. Maria held her breath, feeling Thomas's rapid heartbeat against her chest. The baby had gone silent, as if he too understood that their fate hung in the balance. I take these, Morrison said slowly, and she walks free. Debt paid in full. Debt paid, the young Apache confirmed, and the child stays with his sister. Wade made a sound of protest. Sheriff, you can't seriously be considering... Shut up, Wade, Morrison snapped. He looked at the Apache, then at Maria, then back at the treasures in his hands. Finally, with a grunt of resignation, he tucked the pottery under one arm and pocketed the pendant. Fine. Debt's paid. But girl, he pointed a thick finger at Maria, you step 1 toe out of line again, and there won't be anyone to buy your freedom a second time. Understand? Maria nodded frantically, unable to believe what was happening. Yes, sir. Thank you. Don't thank me, Morrison interrupted gruffly. Thank him. He jerked his chin toward the Apache, though God knows why he'd waste his family's treasures on the likes of you. He turned to Wade. Come on, nothing more to see here. Wade released Maria's shoulder with obvious reluctance and followed Morrison back toward the sheriff's office. Their footsteps faded into the night, leaving Maria alone in the plaza with the 3 Apache men and a bucket of stolen water that was no longer stolen. Maria struggled to her feet, her legs shaking so badly she nearly fell again. Thomas began to whimper, reminding her why they'd been here in the first place. The water. She looked at the bucket, then at the young man who had just given up his family's heritage for strangers. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Why would you do that for us? You don't even know us. The Apache man's expression softened. He knelt beside the well and dipped the tin cup into the bucket, then stood and held it out to her. "Drink first," he said gently. "Then your brother. Then we will talk." Maria took the cup with trembling hands and brought it to her lips. The water was cool and sweet, the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. She drank half, then carefully tipped the rest into Thomas's eager mouth. He gulped it down desperately, some spilling down his chin, and immediately began to cry for more. The Apache man filled the cup again without being asked, and again, until Thomas's cries finally subsided into contented gurgles. Only then did Maria allow herself to truly look at her rescuer. He was younger than she'd first thought, his face unlined, despite the sorrow she'd seen in his eyes. There was a thin scar across his left cheekbone, and his hands, when they'd held the cup, had been calloused and strong. He wore his hair loose, falling past his shoulders like a dark waterfall, and when the moonlight caught it, she could see it gleamed with blue-black highlights. "My name is Takoda," he said, his English careful but clear. "It means friend to everyone in my language, though." A bitter smile crossed his face. "I have learned that not everyone wishes to be my friend." "I'm Maria," she replied, her voice still shaky. "Maria Castellano, and this is Thomas." She looked down at her brother, who had fallen asleep against her chest, his small body finally relaxed. "I don't know how to thank you. What you did, what you gave up." "I know what it is to lose family," Takoda interrupted quietly. His eyes grew distant, looking at something Maria couldn't see. "I had a sister once. She was small, like your brother. When the soldiers came to our village 3 winters ago, I could not protect her." The pain in his voice was so raw that Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm sorry," Maria whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Takoda nodded slowly, acknowledging her sympathy with a slight incline of his head. One of the older men behind him said something in their language, his tone gentle but urgent. Takoda responded without turning around, his words flowing in a musical rhythm that Maria found strangely comforting, despite not understanding them. "My uncles say we should leave before more trouble comes," Takoda explained, switching back to English. "Towns like this, they tolerate us for trading, but not for long, especially not after dark." Maria looked around the empty plaza, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. Lamplight flickered behind curtains in several buildings, and she knew that curious eyes watched from the shadows. Small towns had long memories and sharp tongues, and by morning, everyone would know that an Apache had intervened on behalf of the Mexican girl. "Where will you go?" she asked, then felt foolish for the question. These men clearly knew how to survive in ways she couldn't imagine. "Back to our camp in the foothills," Takoda said. "We came to trade furs and pottery, but..." He gestured at the empty space where his treasures had been. "I think our trading is finished for this visit." Guilt twisted in Maria's stomach. Because of her desperate theft, this man had given up precious family heirlooms. She'd stolen from him just as surely as she'd tried to steal water from the well. "I'll pay you back," she said urgently. "I don't know how or when, but someday I'll..." "No." Takoda's voice was firm, but not unkind. "This is not a debt. This is..." He struggled for the English word, then settled on, "This is what should be done. When someone needs help, you help them. This is the Apache way. This is the way of all good people, no matter their skin or language." Maria blinked back tears. When was the last time someone had helped her without expecting something in return? When was the last time anyone had looked at her and seen a person worth saving rather than a burden to be managed? "But where will you go now?" Dakota asked, echoing her earlier question. "This town, it is not kind to you. I see this in how the sheriff spoke, in how that other man looked at you. You have no family here." "No family anywhere," Maria admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "Just Thomas. Our parents died 6 months ago from fever. The church won't help us, and no one will hire me because of him." She looked down at her sleeping brother. "I've been squatting in an abandoned shed behind the boarding house, but the owner will chase us out eventually." The two older Apache men conferred quietly in their language. Dakota listened, his brow furrowed in concentration, then turned back to Maria with an expression that was difficult to read. "My uncle Grey Wolf says you could come with us," he said carefully, "to our camp. It is not far, maybe 3 hours' walk. We have food, clean water from the mountain spring. You and your brother would be safe there, at least for a few days while you decide what to do next." Maria's heart leapt with a hope she didn't dare trust. "You would do that, after everything you've already given?" "The things I gave were objects," Dakota said simply. "Beautiful, yes, and old, but still just objects. A life, 2 lives. These are worth more than pottery and stones." Maria looked at the 3 men standing before her in the moonlight. Everything she'd been taught, every warning she'd heard about the savage Indians who supposedly raided settlements and killed settlers, warred with what she saw in front of her. 3 men who had shown her more kindness in 15 minutes than the entire town of Socorro had shown in 6 months. And yet, fear whispered in the back of her mind. Could she trust them? Could she really leave the only world she knew, however cruel it had become, to follow strangers into the desert? What if this was a trap? What if... Thomas stirred against her chest and made a small, contented sound in his sleep. His fever had broken, she realized. The water had already begun to heal him, and it was this man, this Apache warrior named Dakota, who had made that healing possible. "Why do you trust me?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know me either. How do you know I won't bring trouble to your people?" Dakota smiled for the first time, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines of survival into something younger, more vulnerable. "I watched you," Dakota said quietly. "For 3 days, I watched you in this town. I saw how you gave your brother the last of your food, how you sang to him when he cried, even though you were tired, how you washed his clothes in the horse trough when no one was looking, because you wanted him to be clean and comfortable." He paused. "A woman who loves like that, she does not bring trouble. She brings light." Maria's throat tightened with emotion. She hadn't known anyone was watching, hadn't realized her small acts of love had been witnessed. The thought that someone had seen her, truly seen her, was almost more than she could bear. "I'll come," she said, the decision settling over her like a blanket. "I don't know what else to do, and I trust you. I don't know why, but I do." Grey Wolf nodded approvingly and said something in Apache. The other older man, whom Dakota introduced as Running Deer, patted Maria's shoulder gently with a weathered hand. His touch was grandfatherly, reassuring in its steadiness. They left Socorro as quietly as they'd arrived, slipping away from the plaza like shadows dissolving at dawn. Dakota led the way, his feet finding paths through the darkness that Maria couldn't see. Grey Wolf walked beside her, occasionally steadying her elbow when she stumbled over unseen rocks, while Running Deer brought up the rear, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for danger. The town fell away behind them, its handful of lights growing smaller and dimmer until they disappeared entirely. Soon, there was nothing but the vast desert night, the star-scattered sky so enormous and bright it seemed close enough to touch. Maria had lived in New Mexico all her life, but always within walls, always within the safety of settlements. She'd never walked through the open desert at night, and the immensity of it both terrified and awed her. "Stay close," Takoda said softly, glancing back at her. "The path is safe, but there are places where the ground is not solid. In the dark, it's easy to step wrong." Maria nodded, shifting Thomas to her other hip. The baby had woken briefly but seemed content to gaze up at the stars with wide, wondering eyes. She was grateful he wasn't crying, wasn't making their journey more difficult than it already was. They walked in silence for nearly an hour, climbing gradually into the foothills. The air grew cooler, pine-scented, and Maria could hear the distant trickle of running water. Her feet, bare and calloused from months of poverty, found purchase on the rocky ground more easily than she'd expected. Perhaps all those nights of walking Socorro's streets, of standing for hours, waiting for work that never came, had prepared her for this. "How much farther?" she asked when Thomas grew heavy in her arms and her shoulders began to ache. "Not far now," Takoda replied. He stopped and turned to face her, his expression concerned. "Are you tired? We can rest." "I'm fine," Maria lied, though her legs trembled and her back screamed in protest. She'd learned long ago not to show weakness, not to admit need. Weakness meant being taken advantage of. Need meant being turned away. But Takoda saw through her brave face. "Here," he said, and before Maria could protest, he'd taken Thomas gently from her arms. "I'll carry him for a while. You rest your arms." Maria wanted to refuse, wanted to insist she could manage, but the relief of having the weight lifted from her shoulders was too immediate and too welcome. "Thank you," she whispered. Takoda settled Thomas against his chest with a natural ease that suggested he'd held babies before. Thomas, perhaps recognizing something trustworthy in this stranger, didn't cry. Instead, he grabbed a fistful of Takoda's long hair and tugged experimentally. "Ah, strong grip," Takoda said with a soft laugh. "He will be a warrior someday." "Or a rancher," Maria suggested, smiling despite her exhaustion. "My father always said Thomas had the hands of someone who would work with horses." "A warrior can work with horses," Takoda replied. "The best warriors are those who understand animals, who can move with them rather than against them." He adjusted Thomas carefully. "My father taught me to ride before I could walk properly. He would put me on his horse and—" He stopped abruptly, his expression clouding over. Maria understood. Some memories hurt too much to finish speaking aloud. She touched his arm lightly, a gesture of comfort that surprised them both with its naturalness. "You don't have to say more," she said gently. Takoda met her eyes, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words, a recognition of shared loss and shared survival. Then Grey Wolf called out something from ahead, and the moment broke. "We're here," Takoda translated. Maria looked up and saw it. A small encampment nestled in a protected hollow between two hills. 5 or 6 hide lodges stood in a loose circle around a central fire pit where embers still glowed. The structures were unlike anything Maria had seen before, conical, practical, beautiful in their simplicity. Smoke rose from the opening at the top of one lodge, carrying the scent of burning cedar. As they approached, figures emerged from the lodges. Maria's heart hammered with renewed fear. What if the others weren't as welcoming as Takoda? What if they saw her as an intruder, a threat? She moved closer to Takoda instinctively, seeking the safety of his presence. A woman appeared first, older, perhaps 50, with long gray-streaked hair in 2 thick braids. She wore a deerskin dress decorated with blue and white beads, and her face was weathered but kind. Her eyes went immediately to Thomas in Takoda's arms, then to Maria, then back to Takoda. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her tone questioning but not hostile. Takoda responded at length, gesturing to Maria, to the baby, back toward the direction of Socorro. The woman listened intently, her expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something that looked like approval. When Takoda finished, she stepped forward and placed both hands on Maria's shoulders, looking directly into her eyes. She spoke in Apache, her voice warm and welcoming. Then, switching to heavily accented English, she said, "I am White Dove. You come, you safe here." Tears sprang to Maria's eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you so much." Other people emerged from the lodges now. Men, women, a few children who rubbed sleep from their eyes and stared at the newcomers with frank curiosity. Maria counted perhaps 15 people total, a small band, Takoda explained later, that had split from a larger group to pursue traditional ways in the mountains, while others moved to the reservation. A young woman, perhaps a few years older than Maria, approached with a clay bowl filled with some kind of stew. She offered it to Maria with a shy smile, saying something in Apache that Maria didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. "Eat, you must be hungry." Maria was starving, she realized. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal. She accepted the bowl gratefully and brought it to her lips. The stew was rich and savory, filled with chunks of meat and roots she couldn't identify, but which tasted earthy and nourishing. She had to force herself not to gulp it down too quickly, not to make herself sick by eating too fast after so long with so little. Takoda handed Thomas to White Dove, who took the baby with practiced ease and began examining him with gentle efficiency. She clucked her tongue at his thinness, his diaper rash, the way his ribs showed through his skin. But her touch was infinitely tender as she carried him to one of the lodges, gesturing for Maria to follow. Inside, the lodge was warm and surprisingly spacious. Buffalo hides covered the ground, and various baskets and tools hung from the lodge poles. White Dove laid Thomas on a soft fur and began stripping away his soiled cloth diaper, talking to him in a soothing stream of Apache. She produced a clean cloth, some kind of healing salve, and within minutes had Thomas cleaned, treated, and rewrapped with an efficiency that spoke of decades of experience with babies. The days that followed passed in a rhythm so different from Maria's previous life that she sometimes felt she'd crossed into another world entirely. In Socorro, each day had been a desperate scramble for survival, begging for work, searching for food scraps, hiding from the landlord, trying to keep Thomas quiet so they wouldn't be discovered in their illegal shelter. Here, life moved with the sun and the seasons, with purpose, but without panic. White Dove took Maria under her wing with a maternal firmness that left no room for argument. Each morning, she woke Maria before dawn to teach her the women's work. How to gather the right kind of wood for fires, how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, how to prepare hides, grind corn, weave baskets from willow branches. Maria's hands, soft from months of inactivity, quickly blistered and then calloused. Her back ached from bending over grinding stones. But for the first time in 6 months, she felt useful. She felt like she was learning something valuable, something that would help her survive. Thomas thrived. Within a week, color returned to his cheeks and flesh to his bones. White Dove nursed him alongside her own grandson when Maria's milk proved too scanty from her own malnourishment. The baby went from crying constantly to giggling, from listless to curious, reaching for everything with fat little fingers. The other children in the camp adored him, carrying him around like a beloved doll, teaching him to laugh at their games. Takoda taught Maria Apache words in the evenings when the day's work was done and the camp gathered around the fire. He was patient, repeating phrases over and over, correcting her pronunciation gently when she stumbled. "Shikis," he'd say, pointing to his mother. "Mother." Then he'd point to White Dove. "Also Shikis. She is like mother to many. Shikis, Maria would repeat, her tongue awkward around the unfamiliar sounds. But gradually, syllable by syllable, word by word, she began to understand. Not just the language, but the worldview it carried, the way Apache words connected everything to relationship, to clan, to the natural world. She learned that Tekoda's name meant friend to everyone, and that his people believed names carried power, that they shaped who you became. She learned that White Dove had lost her own daughter to smallpox and had adopted half the orphan children in the territory into her heart. She learned that the small band lived here, away from the reservation, because they refused to give up the old ways, refused to let their children forget who they were. "The government wants us to farm," Tekoda explained one evening, his voice bitter. "To stay in one place, to cut our hair, to forget our language. They say the Apache way is dead, that we must become like white men or die." "But you're still here," Maria observed softly. "We are still here," he agreed. "But for how long? Each year the soldiers come closer. Each year more of our people go to the reservation because they are starving, because they have no choice. My uncles, they say we are the last. When we are gone, the Apache will be only a story." The sorrow in his voice cut through Maria like a knife. She thought of her own parents, of the language they'd spoken, Spanish mixed with Nahuatl words from her grandmother. She thought of how Father Benedict had insisted she speak only English, how he'd told her that her mother's language was the language of ignorance, that she should be grateful to leave it behind. "Maybe," she said carefully, "maybe being the last doesn't mean the end. Maybe it means you're the ones who carry the seed for what comes next." Tekoda looked at her, really looked at her, and Maria felt heat rise to her cheeks. 3 weeks had passed since that midnight rescue in Socorro, when Running Deer came galloping into camp on his spotted horse, his face grim with warning. The entire camp gathered immediately, reading danger in his urgency. He spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward the east, toward the direction of the town. Maria's stomach clenched with dread even before Tekoda translated. "Soldiers," he said, his voice tight. "A patrol, maybe 20 men. They're searching the foothills, asking questions in Socorro about Apache raiders. Someone told them about our camp." White Dove began issuing orders immediately, her voice calm but firm. Women started packing essential supplies, preparing to move deeper into the mountains if necessary. Men checked weapons, not many, Maria noticed with alarm. A few rifles, some bows, knives, nothing that could stand against 20 armed soldiers. "They'll come for you," Maria said suddenly, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "They'll use me and Thomas as an excuse. They'll say you kidnapped us, that you're holding us against our will." Tekoda's jaw clenched. "You are not prisoners here. Anyone who sees you knows this." "Do you think that matters?" Maria's voice rose with panic. "Sheriff Morrison, he's probably already telling them I was taken by Apache raiders. It's the perfect excuse to attack you, to drive you off this land." The camp fell silent. Everyone was looking at her now, and Maria realized they were waiting to see what she would do. She could leave. She could take Thomas and walk back to Socorro, tell the soldiers she'd been rescued, diffuse the entire situation. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice, but it would also be a betrayal of everything she'd found here. She turned to Tekoda, her heart hammering. "What if I went to meet them? What if I told them the truth, that you saved us, that we're here by choice?" "They won't believe you," he said flatly. "They'll think we forced you to say these things." "Maybe," Maria admitted, "but maybe some of them will listen. Maybe if they see Thomas healthy and happy, if they see that we're not prisoners." "It's too dangerous," Tekoda interrupted, and for the first time since she'd known him, real fear showed in his eyes. Fear for her, Maria realized. These soldiers, they don't want truth. They want an excuse for violence. Then what? Maria demanded. You run? You abandon this camp, these homes because of me? Because you showed kindness to a stranger? She shook her head fiercely. No, I won't let that happen. White Dove stepped forward and placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. She spoke in Apache, her voice steady and sure. Takoda translated, though his expression remained troubled. She says you have the heart of a warrior. The courage lives in many forms, and sometimes the bravest thing is to speak truth to power. Maria looked around the camp, at the people who had taken her in, fed her, taught her, loved her brother as their own, at the lodges that had become home, at Takoda, whose quiet strength had given her back her hope. I'm going, she said firmly. With or without your blessing, I'm going to meet those soldiers and tell them the truth. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Takoda nodded slowly. Not alone, he said. If you go, I go with you. We face this together. Takoda, no, together, he repeated, his voice brooking no argument. He took her hand, and the touch sent warmth spreading through her entire body. You risked everything for your brother. You think I would do less for... He paused, searching for words. For the people I care about? Their eyes met and held. In that moment, Maria understood what he couldn't quite say aloud, what she herself had been feeling but hadn't dared to name. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't just about gratitude or obligation. This was about belonging. This was about love. Then we go together, she whispered. As the sun climbed toward noon, Maria and Takoda walked down from the foothills toward the place where running deer had spotted the patrol. They found the soldiers at the base of the hills, 20 men in dusty blue uniforms, gathered around a lieutenant who was studying a crude map. Maria's steps faltered for just a moment, her courage wavering at the sight of so many armed men. But Takoda's hand found hers, steady and warm, and she drew strength from his presence. "Lieutenant!" she called out, her voice carrying across the scrub grass. "Lieutenant, I'm Maria Castellano. I believe you're looking for me." 20 rifles swung in their direction. 20 pairs of eyes locked onto the sight of a young Mexican woman walking hand in hand with an Apache warrior. The lieutenant, a man with a weathered face and captain's bars that suggested recent promotion, stepped forward with his hand on his sidearm. "Miss Castellano?" he said, his voice wary. "Are you all right? Are you being held against your will?" "No," Maria said firmly, stopping about 20 feet away. She didn't release Takoda's hand. "I'm here by choice. This man, his name is Takoda. He saved my life and my brother's life. He and his people have shown us nothing but kindness." "That's not what Sheriff Morrison reported," the lieutenant said, though his tone suggested uncertainty rather than accusation. "He said you were taken by Apache raiders after being caught stealing water." "Sheriff Morrison is a liar," Maria said bluntly, and several soldiers shifted uncomfortably. "Or at best, he's a man who sees what he wants to see." "The truth is this. I was caught stealing water for my dying brother. The sheriff was going to sell me into servitude and send my brother to an orphanage. Takoda offered his family's treasures to buy our freedom. He didn't take us. He rescued us." The lieutenant looked between Maria and Takoda, his expression thoughtful. "These are serious accusations, miss. Why should I believe you?" "Because I'm standing here," Maria replied. "If I were a prisoner, if I feared these people, would I be walking freely down this hill? Would I be defending them?" She took a breath, choosing her next words carefully. "Lieutenant, I don't know your name, but I can see in your eyes that you're tired of this. Tired of chasing people who only want to live in peace. Tired of fighting wars that have no honor." Something flickered across the lieutenant's face. Recognition, perhaps, or shame. One of the younger soldiers spoke up. "Lieutenant Daniels, sir. She don't look like no prisoner to me." Daniels raised a hand for silence, his gaze still locked on Maria. "And the child? Your brother?" "Thomas is healthy and happy," Maria said, "better cared for than he ever was in Socorro. The Apache women have been feeding him, healing him, loving him. If you want proof, come to the camp, see for yourself." "That's not happening," one of the other soldiers muttered. "Could be an ambush." But Daniels was already shaking his head. "Stand down, Corporal." He looked at Takoda, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, his posture calm but alert. "You speak English?" "I do," Takoda replied evenly. "Your people have been accused of raiding settlements, stealing cattle. My people have been here for generations," Takoda said, his voice steady but laced with steel. "We take nothing that is not ours. But the settlements take our hunting grounds, our water, our sacred places. They call us thieves for trying to survive on the land that was ours first." The truth of his words hung in the air, undeniable. Daniels was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including his own men. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. "I won't lie to you," he said. "I have orders to investigate reports of hostile Apache activity, but I also have eyes, and I can see that whatever's happening here, it's not what Morrison described." He turned to his men. "We're returning to Socorro. I'll be filing a report that we found no evidence of kidnapping or hostile activity." To Maria and Takoda, he added quietly, "But I can't promise the next patrol will be as willing to listen. You should know that." "We know," Takoda said. "We've always known." As the soldiers prepared to leave, Daniels approached Maria one last time. "You're sure about this? About staying with them? Socorro may not be much, but it's your world. Their world." He gestured toward the hills. "It's disappearing." Maria looked at Takoda, then back at the lieutenant. "Maybe," she said softly, "or maybe we're building a new world. One where a Mexican girl and an Apache warrior can stand together. One where kindness matters more than the color of your skin." Daniels nodded slowly, perhaps understanding, perhaps not, but he didn't argue further. 6 months later, the camp had grown. Word had spread of the place in the foothills, where Apache and Mexican families lived side by side, where children learned 2 languages, where survival meant cooperation rather than conflict. It wasn't easy. Old prejudices died hard, and the government still viewed them with suspicion. But they persisted. Maria stood outside the lodge she now shared with White Dove and Takoda, watching Thomas take his first wobbling steps toward a little Apache girl named Ayana. The 2 babies laughed, falling into the dust and getting up again, already friends before they had words to name what friendship meant. Takoda came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him, feeling safe, feeling home. "What are you thinking?" he asked in Apache. She understood perfectly now. "I'm thinking," she replied in the same language, "that sometimes the worst moments lead us to the best ones. That sometimes being broken open is the only way to let the light in." He kissed the top of her head. "The soldiers will come again." "I know, and we'll face them again. Together. I know that too." In the distance, children played. Women worked side by side, speaking in a mixture of languages that was becoming its own dialect. Men returned from hunting, their bounty shared equally among all families regardless of blood or background. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't last forever. The tide of history was against them, pushing them toward reservations and assimilation, toward the erasure of everything they were trying to preserve. But for now, in this moment, they had built something beautiful. They had built something worth fighting for. And it had all begun with a desperate girl stealing water for her brother. and a warrior who remembered his sister's face and chose compassion over cruelty. Some stories don't have neat endings. Some stories are just beginnings in disguise. This was one of those stories.